Welcome to The Check-In, a podcast on the Telos channel where we explore the headlines from Israel-Palestine and across the world, wading into the complexity of seemingly intractable conflict to discover the power of peacemaking to heal us, our community, and our world. This is your host, David Cadabot, checking in from Dallas, Texas today. In the week before we recorded this show, which was last Friday, September 27th, more than 500 people, including 50 children, were killed and thousands more wounded in Lebanon from Israeli missile strikes and coordinated explosions of communications technology. In the days since, Israel has assassinated Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah, in an attack in Beirut, and you will hear our guest mention a bombing that happened just hours earlier. He has confirmed that this was the assassination of Nasrallah. Then, in the past 24 hours, Israel has also launched a ground invasion in the south of Lebanon. The world is reeling from the scale and pace of these events, which portend great suffering for many tens of thousands. Every life is valuable, essential, beautiful. Every life in Lebanon now thrown into chaos and danger. The thousands of Israeli civilians displaced in northern Israel from Hezbollah rockets, and the millions in Gaza stranded in unimaginable conditions, including the Israeli hostages, still to this day. As we watch in horror at the escalation of violence across the region, we've invited a friend of ours who's in Beirut right now to join us on the show. Marwan Aboul-Zelof is the pastor of the City Bible Church in Beirut, which his family planted 8 years ago. Pastor Marwan has Palestinian and Lebanese and Chaldean heritage. He was born in the Middle East and became a U.S. citizen after his family was stranded in the States while on vacation when the U.S. invasion of Kuwait began. We talk through what the past few weeks have been like for him and his community before moving into a larger conversation about the context behind these circumstances and what it looks like to keep asking the question, why? Pastor Marwan then shares with us what it's like looking from the outside in on the American church in this moment, both its unique shortcomings, but also its unique opportunity to support mutual flourishing in the region. It's a difficult but important conversation, so stay with us and enjoy the show. Well, Marwan, we are so grateful that you are joining us in this conversation today, of course, in the most horrific of circumstances. But as we ask all of our guests, where are you checking in from today?
Yes, good to be with you, David. I'm here in Beirut, Lebanon, where we live. I've been living here for the past 8 years.
Well, your insights, your experience, your lived experience in these moments over the past 8 years is so valuable to us as Americans, who don't get to hear everything that happens on the ground. We don't know what it's really like. So we're grateful that you're taking the time out of your day in these really troubling days, the past couple of weeks, to talk with us. Before we really dive into the conversation, into how to think about it as Americans, I do just want to start with who is Marwan and a little bit about your story of being in Lebanon the past 8 years. How did you find yourself there?
Yeah, sure thing. We left actually the U.S. 10 years ago. First 2 years were in Dubai. We're part of a church there. I did a pastoral internship and a church planting residency. But the aim has always been to come here to Lebanon to see a church planted. The reason for that is because we believe that God's regular means of making himself known is through the local church. And so we prepared for that, came out here, my wife and I. At that point, we had one son who was born in Dubai, with the hope and the aim to see our church planted, which by God's grace planted in 2018. City Bible Church is an English-speaking church, growing, fruitful. The Lord has sustained us and done wonderful work. We planted in 2018, and just as a brief demographic, we're about 100 on a Sunday morning. A little bit over 60% would be locals, and the others would be kind of an international expat community living here in the country.
What I know about your story, you grew up early years in the Middle East, found your way to the U.S., and now are in Beirut. So you really had this kind of international experience as far as speaking to different communities. You have relationships in all these different places. Help us understand, as Americans, what has it been like for you and your family and your community over the past several weeks and even many months now?
In Lebanon, we've been living with a sense of uncertainty for lots of other reasons for the last handful of years. Different challenges. We talk about the Lebanese revolution. We think about the Beirut explosion, and I know you know this, but maybe others don't know. We're the closest church to the port at that point, where we're located, less than a quarter mile away. COVID, economic collapse. We currently have an absentee government with no president, and so there's been lots of challenges, lots of uncertainty, and these events that have happened since October 7th have added to that level. Now, some of these things aren't new. Israeli aggression and interaction with them, we've seen over the years, at least in the 8 years that we've been here. But this certainly has been different. And so there's been a few attacks in the last year. We can talk about the one that just happened this evening, still recovering from that, still getting lots of messages not far from us. Wow. The biggest to date, just a couple of hours ago. Happy to talk about that. But there has been a sense of uncertainty about what tomorrow will hold, even making it through the night. And there has been an escalation, as I'm sure you've seen on the news, from kind of the regular sonic booms overhead that shake the home, to the pager explosion, the walkie-talkies, the increased aggression in the south, and now also in southern Beirut. There's lots of people who are dealing with anxiety, PTSD, anger, fear. And so it's been a lot. I think that's how I can say it.
And I've been seeing reports of tens of thousands of people displaced, in the south, but now also all over the country as these strikes have spread. Tell us about what you're seeing in your own community as folks are figuring out what it looks like to stay alive in this moment.
That's exactly it. It's very saddening. It's very frustrating. It feels like much of this didn't have to happen. And I think there have been many points that it could have stopped. And I trust that we'll get to that here in just a bit. But no, there's a sense of fear, anxiety. Again, just 2 hours ago, I guess it was, just 2 miles from where we are, all of Beirut heard it. I mean, I think there was 10 or so big 2,000-ton bombs that dropped. And so people are fleeing. People are on the roads, cars parked along the highway. We as a church are trying to care for those that we have connections with, connecting with other organizations. And it's very reminiscent to the explosion, the Beirut explosion, this drama and chaos and just not knowing what needs to be done because there's so much to be done. And like you said, people are just trying to live. And so it's been lovely to see in some ways how just homes are being opened up. I saw churches are opening up their doors in the country and just really coming alongside one another. So it's a lovely opportunity for the church. And yet there is fear and anxiety, worry, as kind of this central theme of what people are feeling.
I can't imagine, what that must be like with how much uncertainty exists in this moment. Even from an external standpoint, it really is so unclear how big this could go. How this could escalate even larger. We had a guest on our show a couple months ago talking about these issues and the kind of broader widening scope of what we are seeing in Gaza happening across the Middle East. And Hezbollah, as this kind of non-state actor per se, as someone might describe it, is one of the most armed, or if not the most armed non-state actor in the region. And so this has the capacity to really expand in some deeply concerning ways. And so I think we're all watching along with trepidation and concern for you all. I do want to just dive a little bit deeper into understanding who is Hezbollah, right? For many of the folks, who are listening to this call, who are trying to make sense of what they're seeing come out of the Middle East, they may not understand the history of this group, their influence on the ground, and all we have been hearing really over the past year is that Hezbollah and Israel have been trading strikes and rocket attacks, and now there's this larger attack. There's this pager and walkie-talkie explosion. There are these strikes that have killed hundreds of people, including dozens of children. Who is Hezbollah? Who is this party on the other side of this conflict?
It's always more complex than the headline, no matter what the case is, right? And I think that's important. Nuance is important because watching a 30-second clip isn't going to give you a 30-year history. That's, I think, been a root problem here. Now, to answer your question, David, Hezbollah is more than just the terrorist group attacking Israel, right? I mean, I think that's kind of the general headline. They certainly do have a military arm, and there are things that history has shown that they've done in the attacks back and forth over the years. But Hezbollah is not just a group of militants. I think that's usually what comes to mind for someone who's not aware of what's happening. Hezbollah has many in the government, politicians. They are a political party, ultimately, or initially is what they are, a political party that also does works and cares for neighborhoods. And again, not to try to in any way paint them as reverse the image that is said, but it's much more complex. The challenge with Hezbollah is they're also connected to other regional powers, with Iran, which has brought some woes to our country. We can say just with the regional conflict and players, and sometimes Lebanon just wants to be Lebanon. And so at times there is this sense that we're dragged into things that maybe we wouldn't normally be dragged into. And yet it's not just as simple as here are the good guys and here are the bad guys, and it's very clear, very simple. No, Hezbollah is more than just what the media has portrayed them to be.
So that's helpful context to understand the kind of nuance of who this group is, and perhaps why Israel is attacking them right now and escalating this conflict. I mean, we have seen for the past almost a year that Hezbollah has been sending rockets into the north. There are tens of thousands of Israeli civilians who have been displaced from their homes. Attacks that have killed children in northern Israel. So we kind of have a rationale for why Israel is responding this way, but help us understand perhaps what are Hezbollah's intentions, even to participate in this. We saw these rocket attacks increase after October 7th, but what's in it for them per se? What's their rationale and strategic goals in this conflict?
Yeah, I can't say that I know the depth of military strategy or what all the intentions are and even what is happening behind the scenes. But what I can share is both what we're hearing here, because I know that's not always seen on the media in the West specifically, but also to take a glimpse of the history. We don't have time to kind of go into it layer by layer, but the current fighting, now certainly there were issues before, but the current fighting started October 8th. And this was as a result of the fighting in Gaza with the attacks on October 7th and the response and back and forth. And so what is happening today as far as where Hezbollah is concerned, and this is what the press reports have been saying here locally and with Nasrallah's speeches, has been, we are doing this standing alongside the people of Gaza. And so once there's a ceasefire, we will stop. But that's not the history of Hezbollah in Israel. So we can even go back another layer. And again, that's part of the problem here. At what point does a story start? And unfortunately, narratives are being spun and histories are being ignored. And that's just not helpful as we think of peace and true resolution. Now, Hezbollah was created as a response to Israel invading Lebanon. And so at what point do we go back? I mean, the story with Hamas is saying, well, it all started October 7th, but what about 70 years worth of history and aggression and the history of Gaza and when that was closed up? And so this has been the challenge in all of this, and really a frustration for many who have been trying to work. I know that you all at Telos have been trying to work to reveal the truth of history so that way there can be a path forward. But when a person's suffering is ignored, when stories are hidden and untold, then there can never be true healing. There can't be a path forward. And that's part of the frustration here with Gaza, that every time the conversation comes up, the conversation is stopped. If we're honest, the conversation is all that matters is this. And in any story, that can't be how we move forward. And so I think to sum up your question, David, what's happening today with the back and forth and the recent incredible aggression and escalation is tied to October 7th.
I really appreciated the way you talked about how, when the story isn't told fully, there can't be true healing. And that part of the work that we have to do as peacemakers is to ask that why, and to keep asking that why, until we get to the full truth. And it might be that we have to walk through some complexity on the way, that the story might get even more nuanced and convoluted, but there is simplicity on the other side of that complexity. And that's where we need to land, because that's how we actually find the real solutions to the conflicts that plague us. And part of that here is asking the questions of context and history and motivations, but ultimately to recognize too that every party has responsibility here as well, and that until everyone on both sides of the blue line, as it's called, recognizes that there's no future for anyone until there's a future for all people in this region, we're going to be stuck in this. And we know that those who have the most power in this situation, in this case, it would be the Israeli government supported by the U.S. government, right? That they have extra responsibility to manage their reactions so as not to increase the risk of this escalating even further, of more people being killed, of more people being displaced, and this cycle being repeated again and again. And so that's where I want to take us next, is to think about this kind of interaction between the U.S. and Israel in this moment. There were these kind of attacks traded back and forth for many months. The past 2 weeks have seen an immense increase in the violence that is happening, instigated by the Israeli military. And I think it's really easy for us as Americans looking on to to decry the violence, to even feel solidarity with the suffering and anyone who's displaced, or those killed in Lebanon and also in northern Israel, and to call for nonviolence and then to wipe our hands clean. But we do have a part to play in this. In fact, the U.S. government just signed a deal for another $8 billion worth of military aid to Israel as a response to everything that's been happening with this escalation with Lebanon. And so, we have on one side of our government, perhaps, we're saying we're pressing for de-escalation, we're trying to negotiate ceasefire agreements, we're pressuring the Israeli government to refrain from making all this worse. And at the same time, we're continuing to fund and continuing to arm and not really holding any accountability for the actions. In fact, time and time again over the past year, the Israeli government has pushed an American so-called red line even further back, right? So we have this kind of this contradiction at play. So from your perspective on the ground, how do you see that playing out? And what would you want Americans to know right now about what responsibility, but also opportunity they have in this moment?
You said that really well. And I think as a pastor, and as we'll take this back to the scriptures a few times, maybe just in the rest of our time, this is an issue of hypocrisy. And you mentioned something about just everyone has roles and there's responsibilities, and we'll talk about that as well. But I think my voice is speaking to the church. I'm a pastor. I'm both an Arab but also an American, and I grew up in the U.S. And so I think I'm not a politician. I'm not a political analyst. But my voice can only be really spoken to brothers and sisters, and so that's why I do speak in the ways I do. Meaning, there's much evil. There are much criminal activity taking place, and yet in the scope of things, we can see an aggressor. We can see someone who's more powerful than other. And also, I think this is the big angle for me, or at least something that I've recognized, is that the church at large is supporting one group or another. And so some of the pushback about, well, why aren't you calling out Hezbollah or Hamas? Well, I can and I have, right? But I'm mindful that the church doesn't send money to Hezbollah and Hamas. The American church isn't supporting and defending and making allowances for these groups, but they are making those allowances for Israel. And so that's where the conversation, I think, needs to be going. But and maybe you can bring us back to that in just a minute. But just as a response to what's it like on the ground? What is it like for us to watch the press conferences that say we have asked them for an investigation? We are asking, and we will follow up on the deaths of these American citizens, but we want them to finish their investigation. We are asking them to be as mindful as possible and as careful as possible. And yet another bill is signed for another billions of dollars. I mean, I've spoken with friends in the U.S. The outrage that they're feeling, themselves suffering with inflation and these different things, and the amounts of money that they're leaving the country. And so there are layers of this that just make me scratch my head. I have thoughts, and again, I think much of it is theologically rooted. But there is this sense of hopelessness, a sense of hopelessness that's felt. I'm not saying in the church, but just generally, we're hoping. We know that there's conversations happening in the back doors, and we're hoping for these peace negotiations. At one point, I think yesterday we heard where the U.S. and France and others are calling for a 21-day ceasefire. And then, I mean, while the Prime Minister is in the U.S. addressing the UN, they drop 10 2,000-ton bombs 2 miles from where I live. And so the questions are, is anyone being held accountable? And so, I think it's very, very difficult for us to believe in anyone's good intentions at this point, because on the ground, we're seeing escalation. We're seeing red lines, I think is what you're saying. I don't know how many more red lines there are that can be crossed. And so part of the unease is we look at history and say, well, in the past, in 2006, this is how Israel attacked, and these are the areas that they hit. And so I live, in kind of a Christian neighborhood, if you will. I know that won't be fully understood to many of the viewers, but there are areas that are more historically Christian or not, and so you have different groups of people in this way. Certainly, lots of mixture, especially in the cities. But there is this sense of, well, we are in a place that's safe. Hopefully, we might hear things and see things, but the question is, when there's no accountability for anything, and not only no accountability, but a continued supporting with billions of dollars for weapons, it just makes you wonder what will happen. Is there a point that this will stop? And here's the frustration: it can stop. I think earlier I mentioned, and I do think, not to put too much power in the American government, but they are the ones who are protecting Israel and continuing to fund them. And I think as soon as the funding stops, I personally believe, and many do believe, this would end pretty quickly. War is costly. It makes lots of money for many people, but also, again, when the funding stops, so do the projects. And so this is a frustrating thing, because both the one who is saying we are holding accountable certainly isn't. And not only that, but they're arming and equipping. And so a sense of frustration, a sense of helplessness. And yet, just this past Sunday, I preached that we are to keep our eyes on Christ. We're in Mark chapter 13, which is, we're just going through the Gospel of Mark, and happened to be on Mark 13. And it's Family Sunday, which means the kids are with us. And the topic was the end of the world, part 1, because that's what Mark 13 is about. It's about the destruction of the temple and the persecution that will come, and wars and rumors of wars, and we can't plan that, and so we trust that's of the Lord to be in that place at this time. But one of the things that was in that first half of Mark 13 talked about the Antichrist. And I know there's lots of eschatology and thoughts, but the idea with an Antichrist is someone who comes against or in place of Christ. And we know that the spirit of Antichrist has been around as we look at the writings in the Bible and throughout history. And so the hope that I shared from the scriptures are that in these times, it's easier for us to look to Hezbollah or to America or to the UN, or to look to people to come to our rescue. And I think there are important things that can be done, calling senators and making these realities on the ground known. But ultimately, our hope is in Christ, no matter what happens. And that's a message that I'm trying to remind myself, and also to share with our church family.
There's so much to respond to, Marwan, that's really helpful and a powerful invitation, especially for our Christian audiences, that what Christ is offering us is a vision of something beyond this violence and this, conflict and division and death that we see, and it's that, telos per se, this end goal that guides how we live in the present, which is to participate in that kingdom, to participate in its sureness and its promise today when it doesn't feel so sure or doesn't feel so promised, right? So it's an important reminder for us, especially because the ways that we are engaging as Americans and as American Christians, I've said it on the show before, and I'll continue to say it, but we are making it harder for peace to happen in this part of the world because of the ways that we are not holding ourselves accountable, because of the ways we're not, as we put it, self-interrogating, the ways that we are already a part of the problem. And as you're telling us, I mean, this is making no one safer. It's not making anyone safer in the region. It's not making us as Americans safer. I mean, you've mentioned even the American citizens who have been killed. Aysenur Egi, Turkish American activist who was shot and killed by the IDF. You're talking about the ways in which folks on the ground are looking to the U.S. and reacting with frustration, of course, to the ways that we continue to perpetuate this cycle. And ultimately, what is happening is the credibility of the U.S. government is continuing to be eroded across the world because of the way that we are participating and allowing this to go on, when we do, I believe, have great agency to be a part of stopping this in its tracks. And so there's this invitation.
Can I interrupt real quick there, David?
Please.
Not only the credibility of the American government, but of the American church. And that's something I think needs to be said and realized. There can be pushback and there can be many conversations, but to the eyes of the world, especially this part of the world, America is a Christian nation. So Christ and government are both in the same thing, which those of us who are Americans and know kind of the inner workings of this, we separate it so clearly. And yet there is not only a lack of a break in the credibility of the American government, because they're saying we mourn, I just was watching an interview, every death, every innocent death. We mourn that. And yet, here's another several billion. I think not only is there maybe an improper connection of the American church and the American government, right? So that could be held too closely together. But yet, if we separate it, we can still take a look at the American church at large. That is still, after a year nearly, after tens of thousands of deaths, still able to somehow make space that this is okay and this is God's will. And we will continue to pray for Israel. It's a disaster, and it's devastating. Non-believers are angry. I can share that. Believers here are hurt. I live here with family here in Lebanon. I have cousins in Gaza. And all these are Christians. I have family just who work in Haifa and just are outside of Haifa. I also have uncle and first cousins in Bethlehem. And so in all of this, we are those who would say Christ is Lord and King, and yet bombs are raining down. And the American church, by and large, has space for that in their theology. That's something, if I can just even mention here, the credibility has fallen because the whole world now has seen this. Now, I think, again, just in the general, I think sometimes in many spaces, the church should be the leading voice towards peace and towards justice. No matter what that might be, whether those are race issues in the U.S. or political problems in the world, and just being able to stand up for human rights, speaking truth and love and peace. And so not only are opportunities missed that I think the church has had, but unfortunately now what's happening is the church is standing alongside what the world has called the aggressor, right? Not just a few people, but if you look at the UN councils and all the votes that are coming in, it's always vetoed, or there's one voice, and then just the public comments and the sermons that are preached and the articles that are written, the declarations that are voted on by large denominations are all in support of Israel. And that is harming the gospel. And I think this is something that is, it's a sad reality that I'm coming to grips with, that American Christians are always American first. Now, of course, this isn't everyone. This is not every I'm an American Christian. You're an American Christian. There are dear brothers and sisters who would separate their nationality from their kingdom citizenship. But by and large, American Christians across denominational lines are American first. And it's hard because they don't see that. And being American first comes with blindness. It comes with baggage. And something I've shared a few times is that I just wish that the church would hear the rest of the church, right? The U.S. doesn't always need to be speaking on every issue. There are believers here in this region who are crying out for truth and for justice and for mercy. And yet these voices are pressed down. And so it's a very difficult thing. And I'll pause there.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, I so appreciate you sharing what is a very real pain. And it's really important for us to hear it because it's, so often we don't want to. And so often it's too painful for us to think that we could participate in the degradation of in the church, as we would say, God's image and human beings across the world, and those including who are in the church. So it's important for us to hear what you're sharing with us and for us to be challenged. So I just want to thank you for that, and name too what I find to be just a really kind of insidious perception to go along with it, that what for many people feels like a God ordained commitment to support Israel. It's that always at the expense of Palestinians or Lebanese. And what we're trying to say is that any future, any strategy, any process which affords one people dignity, security, freedom at the expense of any of those things for other people, ultimately it is only making those things even harder. It's moving those things away from those folks. And so these kinds of zero-sum beliefs, zero-sum imaginations about how we find our way to peace, how we find our way to freedom, are ultimately making conflict more entrenched in this world. And so we have to think in new ways. It's not about being for or against anyone. It's about transcending those binaries, right? And saying, I am for justice. I'm for flourishing, and that can't come at the expense of anybody. That has to include everyone. And so these strategies and participations of, we're going to support war at any cost, or it doesn't matter how many people die, there are no red lines. Ultimately, that's not even pro-Israel, right? That's actually making the life, or pro-Israeli, as we say, making a distinction between the state and its people. It's not pro the people of Israel, Israeli citizens. And so we have to find a new way into this way of mutual flourishing, as we call it. And that includes the folks in your community as well.
Yeah. And I think as far as what you're saying, we shouldn't be binary and focusing on this thing or this issue and this commitment, but prioritizing justice and truth. I would say that it's a rightly ordered doctrine that needs to direct us. All that's happening today, as we go back again, where does this story start? We can go back and understand that much of this is taking a lesser teaching in the Bible and making it the most important teaching. And again, that has so many implications. For example, the teaching of how the end days will come to pass should not allow us to overlook the Imago Dei, that we are created in the image of God. And if it does, we should step back and say, I wonder if I'm looking at this right. Because exactly what you said, what's happening now is this support for Israel really is blind. And what that means is that there are no red lines. There are just excuses made. And this is where the integrity of the church is crumbling, because we are saying we are for life and for justice, but only certain lives and certain types of justice. And that's not the message that Christ has preached. And so we need to go back to the scriptures, as I, again, am speaking to the American church, and reconsider the ordering of your theology. And again, maybe we can do a whole nother podcast on that one.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
There's so much to mind there in what you're saying, and so much history to understand, even of the heritage of the American church and the way that it has interacted and engaged with these issues. And we have some resources that you can look up on our website to help learn about the history. We have a document we call our frequently asked questions on evangelicals in Israel-Palestine. It's a helpful kind of explainer, a 101 briefing on all of this history. But ultimately, what you're highlighting here is that we have deep implication, but as we are, as we believe, is so important to remember that wherever there is implication, there is opportunity, right? Our hands are mixed in there in the dirt. They're, participating in all of this, but you can't create a beautiful clay pot without getting your hands dirty, right? And now that they are, what are we going to do with that? What are we going to fashion with the clay? And so we are given opportunity today to be a part of the work of peace, to be a part of the work of justice, and ending this escalation and supporting the possibility of mutual flourishing for Israelis and Palestinians and Lebanese folks and all of us, right? Mother Teresa famously said, if we have no peace, it is because we have forgotten that we belong to each other. That's our work to do, as I see it, both as the church in America, as American citizens broadly, as global citizens, is to learn how to belong to each other once again. And I really appreciate your invitation to us, to offer us that imagination and to be really clear on where we have fallen short. We need that. And we're grateful for your honesty there. And we know that there is opportunity on the other side of this as well.
Mutual flourishing. What a privilege to work towards that. And what a beautiful thing that can be if we humble ourselves, listen to one another. I look forward to that day. I pray that we can be a part of it.
Yes, amen. Well, Marwan, we are thinking of you and your family and your community. Of course, you are in my prayers and in the prayers of many. And if there's anything else for folks to be mindful of praying about, we'd love to hear it now before we close up.
I think I would say, let's be praying for peace. Prayer is powerful. And I think often we think about things rather than actually spending time praying. So please pray for us. Pray for peace and friends, work towards peace. Make the phone calls. Share the truth. Read the scriptures. And labor towards, David, what you're saying, this idea of mutual flourishing. We're in this. There's an opportunity for this to collapse to levels that has not been seen. And we pray that would not be the case. But also there's opportunities for reconciliation, for healing, for truth. And so we pray for that end. And as far as keeping in touch, I trust that you'll tag me or whatever it is. Would be happy to make myself available in the ways that I can. Be praying for our church, I pray, or I ask, as we labor to care for those who are hurting and to point ultimately to Christ in all that we do.
That's a powerful word. It definitely can. Folks, we will share social handles in our show notes, and you'll be able to stay in touch. But thank you again, Marwan. Please stay safe. We are thinking of you, and we hope, when this is published, even on the other side of this, that there is peace in our lands.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks, for listening. If you are enjoying the show, please do leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It does help us, or share and get this conversation out into the world, help more folks hear from Marwan. But with that, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.